What happens when a country grows too fast but forgets to prepare for the future? In China, that future has arrived, and it's not pretty. Millions of elderly people are being left behind. Some live alone in ghost villages, others try to survive on minimal pensions, and some end up literally abandoned, depending on charity to eat. Who takes care of them? Who will make sure they don't die of hunger or loneliness? The projection is frightening. 400 million Chinese over the age of 60 by 2040. This means that the country will soon have more elderly people than the entire population of the United States. But what about that? Does the government have a plan? Is the population prepared for this? Today, Bello Mundo takes you inside this invisible crisis, the dark side of China that few people know about. A reality that doesn't appear in advertisements about technology and progress. Number 1. The first impression. If you land in a Chinese metropolis like Beijing or Shanghai, your head will spin with so much grandeur. Wide avenues, towering skyscrapers, electric cars everywhere, and a frenetic pace of modernity. In the midst of this whirlwind, people are using their smartphones to pay for popsicles on the street. Cabs are completely digital. Restaurants have no physical menu. Everything is via QR code. And the internet is so fast that it feels like you're at the forefront of the future. The classic images are there too. The imposing Forbidden City, the Great Wall winding through the mountains, Buddhist temples mingling with international shop windows and sophisticated cafes. From the outside, it's easy to believe that the country has reached an unquestionable level of progress, with cutting-edge technology, renowned universities, and companies dominating global markets. But you only have to walk a little beyond the postcards to realize that there is something that doesn't fit this futuristic image. There, in the alleyways and less busy streets, you see an old man sitting in the doorway of a closed store, staring at nothing. Further on, a group of old ladies collecting bottles to sell and supplement their income. And if your journey takes you beyond the metropolises, you'll find villages where practically only the elderly are left. In some of these towns, 70% of the residents are over 60. That's when the realization hits. There's a China inside China. While the headlines talk about 5G technology, artificial intelligence, and robots, there is an army of elderly people wondering how they are going to pay for the month's medicine, or who is going to look after them when they can no longer manage on their own. Then you might think, they must have children to help, right? And that's where one of the country's biggest dilemmas comes in. The one-child policy and mass migration to distant cities have left millions of elderly people completely isolated. Some had no children at all. Others have just one, who now works miles away without the time or conditions to look after their parents. And this scenario is far from improving. China is facing a colossal challenge: how to care for so many elderly people in such a short space of time. After all, projections indicate that by 2040, the country will have more than 400 million people over the age of 60, a number greater than the entire population of the United States. And that's just the first layer of a much more complex reality that we're going to explore now. Number 2. Millennial roots and the cult of the elderly. To understand the current dilemma, we need to go back in time and see how Chinese culture has always valued its elders. In Confucianism, respect and obedience to parents and grandparents, the famous xiao or filial piety, were considered sacred virtues. For centuries, the family structure was broad and strong. Did a grandparent need help? He had 5 or 6 children as well as grandchildren, all living together or, at the very least, in close proximity. And don't think that an elder was treated as a burden. Quite the opposite. They were the guardians of knowledge, responsible for family rituals and advisors to the community. That's why many classical Chinese paintings depict elders as symbols of prosperity, longevity, and harmony. This model has worked for centuries, but the world has not stood still. The Cultural Revolution, economic reforms, and, above all, the one-child policy broke down this family structure that had worked for centuries. Families shrank. Young people moved to the big cities. The elderly stayed behind. If before an entire village would mobilize to take care of a grandparent, today the scenario is different. Many live alone without children nearby, relying only on neighbors and minimal pensions to survive. And the problem is only growing. With advances in medicine and quality of life, the Chinese are living longer than ever. But an elderly person who lives longer needs more care, more medicine, more support. And who is going to guarantee all this in a country where the population is aging at an alarming rate? Respect for the elderly remains a strong value in Chinese society. But in practice, what used to be a tradition has become an unsolvable dilemma. What's worse, this is only the beginning. Number 3. The first warning sign. It wasn't overnight that the issue of old age in China became a national crisis. Back in the 90s and early 20s, experts were already warning that China was aging too fast. But at the time, the government had other priorities: accelerated economic growth, industrial expansion, entry into the World Trade Organization. As skyscrapers rose in Beijing and Shanghai, a whole generation of young people left the countryside for the metropolis. And who was left behind? The elderly. In many rural regions, what used to be villages full of life, with children playing and large families together, have become veritable ghost towns of old people. Empty houses, schools closing for lack of pupils, and a predominantly gray population trying to get by as best they can. The situation became even more serious when the birth rate plummeted. Fewer babies being born, more elderly people living longer. And then came the question that no one knew how to answer. Who is going to support this aging population if the number of young people only decreases? And worse, who is going to look after the millions of elderly people who live alone, with no children around, no accessible hospitals, and no support network? It was against this backdrop that stories began to emerge that no one would have imagined seeing in modern China. Elderly couples surviving alone, old people collecting cans in the street to supplement their pensions, and even cases of total abandonment. The country that had prided itself on its respect for the elderly was now racing against time to avoid social collapse. Number 4. The one-child policy and the domino effect. Implemented in the 1980s, the one-child policy sought to curb population growth. In fact, it succeeded. The birth rate plummeted. However, the side effect was not long in coming. If before you had 4 or 5 siblings to share the care of your parents, now you're left with a single child who also has to cope with a competitive job, raising a family, paying sky-high rent in a big city. And where's the time and money to support the elderly? What's more, there are cases in which the only child, for reasons of study or work, ends up moving abroad. The result? Parents and grandparents stay in the country, living independently as far as they can. When health begins to fail, the situation becomes a drama. Not to mention the families who didn't have children or who lost them in accidents, illnesses, and then, who takes care of them? There are reports of elderly people totally without relatives who have to get by on very low pensions. And don't think that this reality is only in the countryside. In many cities, entire neighborhoods have sprung up where only the elderly live. The young people have left, and what's left are silent buildings with no children, no movement, and no basic services. Markets close, hospitals fill up, and everything slows down. This scenario goes against everything that Chinese culture has preached for centuries. Taking care of parents has always been a sacred duty, but now, between tradition and reality, the gulf has never been wider. Number 5. From bad pensions to elderly orphanages. Now to the most shocking point. Many of these elderly people live practically on the poverty line. Rural pensions are much lower than urban pensions, and for those who have never worked in a large industry or state-owned company, the benefit can be almost symbolic. Think of an allowance so low that it's barely enough to buy blood pressure medication. In some isolated areas, the calculation is simple. The elderly person doesn't receive enough, doesn't have the strength to continue working in the fields, and their children, if they exist, don't have the money to cover all the costs either. And so the stories of abandonment multiply. It was against this backdrop that the international press discovered places known as orphanages for the elderly. These are Buddhist temples, churches, or NGOs that open their doors to take in abandoned or homeless elders. One of the most famous cases is the Jisheng Temple in Fujian province, where the nun in charge takes in frail men and women, offers them food and a place to sleep. At first glance, it seems wonderful that such a network of solidarity exists. But when you think about it, it's frightening that something so basic, having a roof over your head and minimal care, depends on donations and voluntary efforts. What does this say about the social security system? The scariest thing is that many elderly people arrive at these places in critical condition. There, many elderly people arrive with wounds, malnourished, without any recent medical care. Some improve their health a little, others simply spend their last days there, receiving at least a little dignity. But these shelters are small and insufficient. And if today there is already a humanitarian crisis to take care of this population, what will happen when a third of China is made up of elderly people? Number 6. Pensions, lack of labor, and regional inequality. China does have a pension system, but it is not unified. Each province or city manages its own funds, and where the economy is stronger, such as Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangdong, there are more resources to support retirees. However, in less developed regions, especially in the northeast and the interior, the account doesn't close. The result is huge pension deficits in certain areas and the threat that the system could soon become insolvent. Experts warn that if nothing changes, there will be a gigantic shortfall by around 2035. Therein lies another issue. The workforce in many basic sectors of care for the elderly simply doesn't exist. There is a shortage of professional caregivers, nurses specializing in geriatrics, physiotherapists, and those who could do this kind of work sometimes prefer other, more lucrative occupations. The richest cities try to solve this by opening premium nursing homes with excellent infrastructure but very high prices. At the same time, public institutions are few and have huge queues. There has been talk of 10,000 people waiting for a place in a 1,000-bed nursing home in Beijing. Meanwhile, thousands of private nursing homes have empty beds because no one can afford the monthly fees. All this confusion creates a regional chasm. If you grow old in Shanghai, your chances of finding a slightly better facility are greater. If you're in the stagnant northeast or in the remote interior, you make do as best you can. Number 7. Curative attempts and pilot projects. Is the government standing still? And to be honest, it can't stand still. Since 2016, China has been testing long-term care insurance in 15 cities. The idea is simple. Each urban worker contributes to a single fund that helps cover nursing, retirement homes, and rehabilitation. The problem? There is no national standard. Each city sets its own rules, and demand is already huge. What's more, the homes accredited to receive this benefit can't cope with everyone. Those who do get a place may have some support, but the quality of care varies absurdly. At the same time, the government has drawn up an ambitious plan. By 2025, all provinces must have a basic care system for the elderly. This includes home visits for those who live alone, accessible medical care, and the construction of more public homes. Does this sound like progress? Yes. But critics describe these measures as a temporary bandage because without solving the central problem, the mismatch between the young and elderly population, the lack of qualified professionals, and the pension fund shortfall, the crisis will only be pushed forward. Meanwhile, one-off solutions emerge. NGOs distributing meals, volunteers visiting lonely seniors, local daycare programs for the elderly, where they spend the day busy with activities so as not to be left alone. All this is commendable, but when you're talking about a country with more than 1,400,000,000 people, it's like trying to put out a forest fire with a bucket of water. Another growing model are community homes run by neighborhood associations, where the cost is lower and the structure simpler, shared rooms, basic food, and some recreational events. But the queue to get a place is endless. And when these places can't cope, there are scandals about mistreatment, neglect, and overworked staff, dealing with elderly people who need much more attention than the system can provide. It is against this backdrop that sad stories emerge. Elderly people who prefer to stay at home alone, even if they are ill, so as not to be a bother. Elderly people who spend 3 times as long walking to the market because they don't want to bother their children. And those who, with no way out, simply give up. The question remains, how long does China have before this crisis reaches the point of no return? Faced with all this, China finds itself between a cross and a sword. On the one hand, official propaganda insists on promoting traditional family care values and launching pilot programs that are still on paper. On the other hand, the clock is ticking. More and more elderly people are becoming dependent on special care, while the birth rate continues to fall. If you thought China was all about TikTok, economic growth turbines, and lantern parties, you now know that there is another huge side, and one that is somewhat underestimated by the spotlight. A side that involves loneliness, abandonment, and many challenges to maintain the dignity of those who have worked so hard all their lives. And now, we want to hear from you. What surprised you most about the reality of old age in China? Leave your comment below and share this video with anyone who also likes content that goes beyond the obvious. And if you enjoyed this journey, stay tuned to Bello Mundo, because there's still a lot to explore about what happens in China and the rest of the world when the tourist cameras turn off. See you in the next video with more stories that nobody tells you. Thanks for watching and see you next time.